Is our graph, a given graph of y is equal to g of t. So I drawn here, we have the y-axis and we have the t-axis. Typically, we think of the y-axis being our vertical axis and the x-axis as being our horizontal axis. But here we have a function, instead of g of x, we have g of t. So our independent variable is t. So instead of the x-axis, we have the t-axis. Okay, so this is our function, and then, well, we'll give it, so the domain here is, well, -4 to 0, right? The domain is all the possible inputs. As you go along the t-axis, we go from -4 to 0. So you can put in any input from -4 to 0 and get an output. So the domain is -4 to 0, and the range, all the possible outputs, well, the outputs go from y equals -3 up to 0. Therefore, the range is -3 to 0. Now, for part A, we are looking to at the graph of g of -t. So for part A, we have the function g of -t. Okay, well, the domain here is then going to be 0 to 4, right? We basically swap the domain, because what we're going to look at, well, what does this negative do inside the function here? But this is the domain is going to be 0 to 4 inclusive, and then the range is, well, the range, this reflection inside the function here doesn't affect the range, so the range is still -3 to 0. Okay, what does that graph look like? Well, this is going to be a reflection about the y-axis, right? Anything inside the function affects your domain, affects your x values. So a reflection about the y-axis actually affects the x, or in this case, the t values. So our new graph is going to look like so. So again, we have our y-axis, our t-axis, and then we just take this graph and we reflect it about the y-axis. So we're going to look something like this, right? So then we go from, again, this is from 0 to, this is now 4. And this is still -3, right? The range is not changing, reflecting about the y-axis, but the domain is changing, right? It's just the opposite, right? Now, instead of going from -4 to 0, we now go from 0 to 4. Okay, so there's part A. Then for part B, we're given the function -g of t. So instead of g of -t, what happens when we have the negative sign out front of the function? So we have negative g of t. Well, this is now going to affect the range. Anything outside the function affects the range. So the domain of -g of t, well, that's the same as g of t, which was -4 to 0. And then the range, well, the range is now going to go from 0 to 3. And, well, what does this graph look like? Well, this is going to be a reflection about the t-axis. Typically, it's a reflection about the horizontal axis. Typically, that's the x-axis, but in this case, it's the t-axis. This is a reflection about the t-axis. So our new graph is going to look something like this. We take that graph and we reflect it about the t-axis. So we're going to look like something like so. So now we're going from, again, this is -4. So we're going from -4 to 0. It doesn't change on our domain, but now reflecting about that horizontal axis, the range gets swapped. So now we're going from 0 up to 3. So this is 3 on our y-axis. All right, so there's the graph of -g of t, a reflection about the t-axis. Okay, and then for part C, well, we now have the function g of t plus 3. So g of t plus 3, again, that plus 3 is going to be outside of the function. So that's going to be a vertical shift, which affects our range. So we're shifting 3 units upward. So our domain of g of t plus 3, where our domain is not changing, so our domain is the same as g of t. So that's -4 to 0. And then our range well, we just shift up by 3 units. So the range now goes from 0 to 3. Instead of -3 to 0, we now shift it up by 3 units. So the range is going from 0 to 3. Okay, and that graph is going to look, well, it's just shifting up by 3 units. So it's this graph here, shifting up. So the vertex is now going to become on the t-axis if we shift it up by 3 units. So that graph is going to look like so, right? And this point now is at -2, right? Because the vertex was at -2. So that's going to be at -2. And then we come up here. This is going to be 3 on the y-axis. All right, so there is g of t plus 3. We just take g of t, and that plus 3 shifts us up vertically by 3 units. Okay, now let's look at part D. So part D, we have the function 1 minus g of t, okay, which could be thought of as minus g of t plus 1. So we have a that minus outside of the function. That's a reflection about the t-axis, and then the plus 1 shifts us up by 1 units. So if you this what we're given is 1 minus g of t. That's the same thing as this is equal to negative g of t plus 1. Okay, then we see that we actually had that plus 1 outside the function. That's a shift up by 1 unit, but the negative outside, again, also reflects affects the range. That's going to be a reflection about the t-axis. So our domain then becomes -4 to 0. And our range becomes 1 to 4. Right? So the domain isn't affected. This is only affects the range. So again, we're reflecting about the t-axis, right? Basically makes the opposite sign, and then we shift up by 1 unit. So our range is now from 1 to 4. Okay, and then our graph again looks like this. So here's our y-axis, our t-axis. So now we're shifting it, or first we reflect it about, so we go upside down and then shift it up by 1 unit. So we're going to be up here. This is now 4. Our vertex is up here at 4, and we come down, and we come down, and we hit this here is at 1 on the y-axis. And we never actually touch the t-axis. Now we're actually above the t-axis. We shifted it up by 1 unit. So there is a new graph of 1 minus g of t. Okay. Now let's go on to part E. So in part E, we have the function g of negative t plus 2. Okay, so this is all inside the function now. So this should be affecting our domain. So what's going to be happening here? We have the reflection about the y-axis, the negative t inside, affects our domain. That's a reflection about the y-axis. And then we shift 2 units to the left. The plus 2 inside the function, you can think of as we basically, it's the opposite. We move the opposite way, however the sign is, if it's inside the function. So this is going to be a reflection about the y-axis, and then shifting 2 units to the left. Not the right, but the left. Okay. So our domain of g of negative t plus 2 becomes -2 to 2, and our range becomes -3 to 0. Okay, so this graph is going to look like so. So here's our y-axis, our t-axis. So here's again our y, our t-axis. So now, okay, the vertex is down here at, that's going to be -3. And then we come up and we hit right here. This is going to be 2 on the t-axis, and then -2 over here. This is -2. All right, and there is the graph of g of negative t plus 2. Okay. Looking at part F. So in part F, we have the function g of t minus 2. So g of t minus 2. Again, this is inside the function. That affects our domain. This is going to be a horizontal shift, and it's going to be shifted 2 units to the right, right? The opposite sign. So we have a t minus 2. That shifts us 2 units to the right. That's the only thing that's going on here, just shifting 2 units to the right. So then our domain is then affected. So our domain is negative 2 to 2. And our range stays as negative 3 to 0. Okay, so the graph is going to look like, so here again, y-axis, t-axis. So we're down here at negative 3 again is our vertex. And yeah, we go from 2 to negative 2. All right, again, this is just a shift 2 units to the right. Okay, on to part G. So in part G, we have the function g of 1 minus t. So g of, oops, g, wait a minute. All right, so g of 1 minus t. Okay, so the domain here is going to be negative 1 to 3. And the range is going, well, this again, just inside the function, so that only affects our domain. So the range stays at negative 3 to 0. So here, our function is what happens. Well, again, 1 minus t, again, could be thought of if you want. This is the same thing as g of negative t plus 1, right? So that's going to be a reflection about the y-axis, and then we're shifted 1 unit to the left, the opposite sign. So we have our graph that looks like so. So here is our y-axis. Here is our t-axis. And then, so now we're going to go from, this is going to be negative 1 on the t over to 3. And then the vertex, give it the point 1. So here's, let's say 1. And then we're down to negative 3. This is a negative 3. So our vertex is right here, and our graph is going to look like so. All right, so there is g of 1 minus t, or g of negative t plus 1, if you want to think of it that way. All right, on to h. All right, so in h, we have the function negative g of t minus 4. So negative g of t minus 4. All right. So the domain here is going to be 0 to 4. And the range, well, that is going to is 0 to 3. So the range is 0 to 3. So what's happening here? Well, we see we have a 4, right? T minus 4. That's going to shift us 4 units to the right, opposite sign there. So a 4 units, a horizontal shift, 4 units to the right. And then this negative sign outside of the function reflects us about the t-axis. So here is our y-axis. Here is our t-axis. So the vertex is at the point 2, 3. So here's, let's say 2, let's say 3. So the vertex is here, and we come down to the origin, and then we come over to the point 4 on the t-axis. So here is the point 4. All right, so again, there is negative g of t minus 4. That again is a shift 4 units to the right, and then a reflection about the t-axis, and then we are done. All right, take care.